What's up, everybody? Welcome to BioS3 Raw TV. Well, today's video is going to be, well, I should start by saying it's a touchy subject, but I think what needs to happen is emotion needs to be taken out of this, and feelings need to be taken out of this, and this whole situation needs to be looked at objectively. And I'll be honest with you, just about everybody I've seen online, and everybody around me too has their opinions, but a lot of them are based on emotions and how they feel, and how they themselves are charged up about the situation and what they feel about it, rather than actually looking at the facts. And I'm going to go through the facts right now and hopefully give a very unbiased opinion about what's happening. And I'll be honest with you guys right now, this may be something that people are for or against, but my personal feeling on the George Floyd case, Derek Chauvin, I believe his name is Chauvin, whatever his name is, the officer that is has been arrested and charged with killing George Floyd, there was no way that the jury could come back with a not guilty answer. There's no way. The decision had to be guilty, plain and simple, period. That was the only way this was going to go. Now, let me explain. I know there's a lot of people that want to understand where I'm coming from with this and how I came to this conclusion, but the only outcome of this trial was a guilty verdict, period. Bear with me. I do have a little bit of experience with this. I myself was private police before. I was a public safety officer. I was private security. I was public security. I was an S2 shift supervisor, a sergeant. And what that means is I was responsible for the second shift and all the officers that were there and everything that they were doing. Now, that being said, I do have experience with it. We worked hand in hand with the Providence Police, Providence Fire Department, and excluding the Providence Gang Unit. So I had years of experience dealing with them also. Now, that all being said, you know, I was absolutely fortunate enough to work with people that would explain things to me that, you know, you would learn as you go. However, sometimes you make mistakes as you go, and that's how you learn. Well, I was fortunate that people around me giving me instructions so that I don't make those mistakes, etc. Now, that all being said, let's look at the facts. Let's start at the beginning, right? George Floyd had walked into a convenience store or whatever store it was and tried to pass off a fake $20 bill. Now, that in itself, let me just tell you, fake money, counterfeit money, you are not playing. Like, the government will not fucking play with you. Like, it doesn't matter who you rat out or how many people you rat out, where you got the money from. Bottom line is, your ass is going to fucking jail if you have counterfeit money. Period. That's all there is to it. Now, that being said, he was going to jail one way or the other. So, someone calls the police. They show up. And the next thing you know, this struggle ensues. Now, the struggle started when George Floyd was approached by the police officers. We saw the whole thing on camera, right? We saw everything that went down, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's the deal. With a fake $20 bill being passed off and police being called for that, and you have multiple officers responding to that scene, there should have been a shift supervisor, sergeant, and S2, whatever you want to call it. There should have been someone like that on the scene with this, because this is a very specific case. Counterfeit money is not a joke. Like, it is a federal case. The FBI is going to be involved. It's a big thing, right? So there should have been somebody in authority at the scene. I don't know if there was or there wasn't. There were multiple officers there. Nobody seemed to be taking charge and taking control over it, so I'm not really sure. But there should have been someone overseeing that whole situation. Now, that being said, I don't know if you guys can hear the leaf blower out there. The guy's doing the grass. That being said, what I noticed was George Floyd acting very erratic, okay? So he started to really kind of act up once the police got there, and I didn't hear and I didn't see, not saying it didn't happen, but myself being the officer that was arresting or the assisting officer, when he was acting like that, my first course of action would have been to ask, sir, did you ingest any illegal drugs, illegal substances, medications, or alcohol today? You're acting very erratic. Now, I didn't hear that and I didn't see that. Just based on his body language and what was happening, that would be the next step in the way that I was trained and the way that I view it. Now, depending on what he said, if he said, yes, I took drugs, I took fentanyl, I took whatever, immediately we would call the ambulance and have some kind of medical services on him immediately, okay? That's first and foremost. So, whether Chauvin asked or he didn't ask, I don't know, but the bottom line, it was his job to actually ask that. Now, eventually, George Floyd winds up in the car. He winds up on the ground. Now, here's the deal. Had George Floyd been left in that car and not put on the ground and restrained by Officer Chauvin, and he had ingested some kind of drugs that caused an overdose, now, technically, he wasn't murdered. He overdosed on a drug. The police officer should have asked. If he didn't ask, that's negligent on him. That would have been a whole different ball game, because a lot of people are pointing to the toxicology reports and says, hey, you know, this guy overdosed. It wasn't the cop that killed him, da-da-da-da. Hang on, okay? Hang on. If he was in the back of the car and he started to overdose, they could have gotten medical help to him fast enough, hopefully. You know, bottom line is, as soon as he started acting erratic like that, then they should have had the EMS on the scene so that they could decide whether or not this individual had ingested something or it was just his mental state of mind or whatever the case may be. However, that procedure was not followed. Now, if he had passed away or if he had started to overdose in the back of the car, it's not from the police force being used, which the legal force, it's not from someone being restrained. It is on his own accord that he ingested these drugs because he was going to get in trouble, go back to jail, so that he overdosed. Now, again, you can say, well, he ingested drugs. There's a toxicology. There was nobody hurting him. There's nobody shot him. Nobody restrained him. Nobody held him down. That was his own will of accord. He did that to himself. That's a whole different ballgame again. However, that is not what happened. Now, the second that Chauvin put him on the ground and put his knee on him. Now, there's different camera angles. Some show behind the neck, some show in the shoulder blade. Regardless of where his knee was, George Floyd was in custody. Chauvin put him in custody and detained him with handcuffs. At that point, by law, Chauvin is now responsible for his well-being and his life, period. Hands down. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Once you take someone into custody, you detain them, you are responsible for their safety and or their life, period. Now, that being said, George Floyd is on the ground. He's saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. We hear that, right? So now it is up to Chauvin to determine, can he really not breathe? It didn't look like he really gave a shit. I'll be totally honest with you. That's just what I saw. Now, depending on where Chauvin actually polices, he may see a lot of stuff like that where people fake a lot of things to try to get out of things. And, you know, I get both sides of the story. However, again, Floyd is on the ground. He's detained. He's restrained. And Chauvin is responsible for his well-being. Now, whether or not George Floyd overdosed, whether or not it was Chauvin who put the pressure on him that killed him, whether or not it was a panic attack or a heart attack, it doesn't matter by law. Chauvin was still responsible for his well-being while in his custody, period. Now, there were absolutely mistakes made, like I just said. I didn't see him ask him about the drugs. I didn't see them get EMS there because he was acting like something was way off. So at the very least, Derek, to cover his own ass, should have had EMS show up and, you know, at the very least, do a once-over on him, make sure that he's okay and that he can actually, you know, be transported to the prison, not have to go to the hospital for whatever the case may be, whether it's a mental illness or drug overdose or whatever the case may be. Steps were missing, right? When he was actually acting erratic like that, they could have put him in the back of the car and said, hey, you put the windows down and said, we're going to leave him there. We're going to let the S2 show up. We're going to start filing the reports, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't do that. They took him out and put him on the ground. For what reason? I don't know. I don't understand. It wasn't like George Floyd was in the car kicking the windows, trying to bust the windows out, which in the case, they could hog tie him like that and put him there too, which may have resulted in the same circumstance because he'd be in the same position, laying face down, prone like that, not able to breathe. But the bottom line is, why they took him out of the car, I'm not really sure. I'll be totally honest with you. I mean, there's lots of times where police put people in cars, they scream, they yell, and they cry, and they do all this. They just leave them in the car. They're locked up in the car. They're in a cage. They can't hurt anybody. They can't really hurt themselves unless they bang their head against the cage. But the bottom line is that would be procedure. Why they took him out and put him on the ground, I don't know. That was an absolute mistake on their part. And again, that officer who put him in custody, the other officers are also responsible, but the officer's cuffs who go on that individual, that officer is now responsible for that detainee, not prisoner yet, but detainee. So we have Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd. The result is a death. Who's responsible? Well, George took drugs. That may be true. George was a lifetime criminal. That may be true. George had phony money. That may be true. None of that negates the fact that his safety comes first and foremost to get to the jail where he's going to be processed, and then in prison or whatever the case may be, released on bond, bail, whatever the case may be. His safety is number one. Once he is handcuffed, detained, restrained, whatever you want to call it, he's no longer a threat. Now, he was acting a little crazy and he seemed like he was out of his mind, but he wasn't a threat. He wasn't trying to hurt the officers. He was just out of it. You could have left him in that car and he would have been fine. Bottom line is they put him on the ground and they're responsible for him. Now, how do you, as a police officer, as a judge, as a jury member, as whatever, when the law faces you right in your face and says, you're responsible for the prisoner, the detainee's life. You're responsible for their well-being until they're at the police station, they're at the jail, they've been processed, and they're in the cell. Through that whole process, you're still responsible. You don't just drop them off and go back on the street. You go in there with them, you process them, you file the reports, you put them in the cell, they do a full checkup on them, make sure everything's okay, etc. You're responsible as the officer for his safety until he gets to the jail. Derek Chauvin was wrong. The steps he did may not have technically killed George Floyd because of the medication that, or I should say the drugs that George Floyd ingested. However, his actions, he put all the onus on himself. He put everything on himself to make sure that George Floyd was okay and didn't take the necessary steps to make sure that George was okay. And where the S2 or the supervisor was, I mean, maybe there was another call, whatever the case may be, like, look, here's the deal. Somebody has to show up at these scenes of these things like this. And apparently somebody maybe showed up after. I don't know what happened. The whole thing was a clusterfuck. But the bottom line is there is no way on God's green earth that Chauvin should have had him on the ground like that, kneeling on him like that. And at that point, he dies. There is no way on God's green earth that a not guilty verdict should have, could have, or would have ever come into play. And that's just the bottom line. You can have the defense argue all day long that, hey, they put their knee on him, they did this, they did that, they did this. You could have the prosecution, you could have the defense saying, well, he ingested drugs and he was a lifetime criminal. Like, they're throwing all these facts around, which that's great. But what about the fact that Chauvin fucked up? That's it, plain and simple. Had he not done that, put him on the ground, despite the ingestion of the drugs, even if George Floyd had died of a drug overdose, this still wouldn't be happening. He probably would have caught a charge anyways. Because again, if George Floyd ingested drugs and he didn't ask him, right? Did you ingest any drugs? You're acting a little crazy. Did you take any drugs? Are you on any medications? Did you take any alcohol? Did you mix alcohol with any medications, et cetera, et cetera? As a police officer, if you're not trained well enough to see that, you shouldn't be on the street, plain and simple. But had protocol been followed, the EMS would have been there. They would have never had to hold him on the ground like that. I think the whole situation would have been different. I think George Floyd would be alive today had protocol actually been followed. The problem is protocol wasn't followed. Now, I don't take that as a police brutality thing. I take that as a police officer who was not trained well enough or just didn't give a shit well enough, which means that he should not be walking the streets enforcing the law unless he's willing to do it by the book. Do it the way that it's supposed to be done, that releases him of all liability. This guy said the other thing. Releases him of all liability, releases the police station of all liability, and puts now the responsibility on the individual who consumed the drugs, etc., whatever the case may be, broke the law, had fake money, whatever the case may be. That's not what happened. So, in closing, guys, taking emotion out of this, taking all the feelings out of it, taking all the hate, taking all the bad karma out of everything that's going on with this and looking at it for what it is, it was a breakdown in the law. I shouldn't say the law, but man, this guy's just going ham out there. It's a breakdown in the arrest detaining process that wasn't followed by the book. That's like if you arrest somebody, you don't read them their rights. You have to read them the Miranda rights. You have to. That's part of it. If you don't, they can get off on a technicality, right? Why? Because you didn't follow the steps. You didn't follow the law. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. Chauvin did the same thing in this. So it's not really any different. There's rules you have to go by. There's a checklist you have to go down. He skipped steps. He didn't go by the rules. He broke the rules. He paid for it by his prisoner dying. and now he has to pay the price, but that's on him. As a police officer, you should know what you need to do every single time. And it wasn't like it was a situation where you showed up, there were guns going off and people were fighting and stabbings and pipe bombs and all kinds of crazy stuff. You know, when he showed up, yeah, of course, Floyd and his buddies were a little off, but I mean, let's be real. I mean, they could just be like that. Bottom line is he didn't assess it properly, he didn't execute properly, and as a result, a death resulted. And now we have, you know, this entire upheaval of America, period, based on what happened. But the bottom line is the police officer was in the wrong. The police officer did not follow protocol. The police officer is responsible. And there is no way that a jury could not have convicted him. Hopefully this sheds a little bit of light on things, guys, because I don't know, you know, of course, now we have this thing with Maxine Waters, who came out and crossed state lines, and now there's a possibility that this thing could be overturned based on her actions, and the judge said it right in the trial. Now, that, again, is the law doing what it does, right? Chauvin is guilty. He didn't follow the protocols. George Floyd died as a result of it. Maxine Waters interjected and gave her whole spiel, and now there's a possibility that the defense can actually go and have the whole thing overturned based on that, which now nullifies the entire thing, and Chauvin would have gotten away with it. So I don't think it's over. I think that, you know, there's still more playing into this. But the bottom line is I figured I would share this stuff with you guys because this is the truth. This is reality. This is things that people are not really talking about. This is things that I think because emotion and because feelings are so wrapped up into it, and many people are going after police officers saying that they're fucking the devil, and police officers saying, we're trying to protect you, fuck you. And they're going back and forth, and nobody's actually saying, well, here's the deal. This solves the entire problem, right? And this sheds light on the situation that really shows that, you know what, there was a police officer that didn't follow protocol. Whether he was racist or not, don't really know. But the bottom line is he didn't follow protocol, someone passed away. We have an individual who was a lifetime criminal, however, may not have passed away if he didn't ingest the drugs. However, he could have gotten help if the Chauvin had gotten the EMS there fast enough. I mean, let's be real. Watching George act the way he did, you had to know he was on something, right? And you have to, you know, look at his police record, and there's all these drug charges. You have to know he's on something. So just to cover your own ass, you call the ambulance, you have them come down, you have them take care of him. I don't see what the problem is. I think that it was just a very negligent situation all the way around by the police, and you know, hopefully this sticks. And the bottom line is shit like this doesn't happen to happen again. And I hope that what I'm saying now gets brought up more and more in the general public so that other officers and people that are in police work see this and say, next time something like this happens with me, I'm covering my own ass. I'm calling EMS right away. I'm getting him medically cleared, and we're not going to go through this bullshit, right? Because I am responsible for another person's life. And there isn't a whole lot more powerful feeling than knowing that you're responsible for keeping the other person alive when they're completely helpless and detained and restrained like that. It's quite the feeling. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. You got something out of it, and it shed some light that we really should be coming together and not being pulled apart by stuff like this. We should be picking this apart and then coming together to try to figure out how to stop this from happening again in any way, shape, or form, instead of fighting and arguing. And that's my hope with this video, is to not stir shit up, but give some people some relief to understand that, look, this is the way it went down, and regardless of what people's feelings are or how their emotions are, this is the law. I'm BioStreet. Thank you guys for listening. And I'm BioStreet, and I approve this message. And we're out.